Between 1500 and 1650, Spanish galleons carried more than 2 billion pesos worth of gold and silver across the Atlantic Ocean. Pirates captured fewer than 3% of them. The other 97% didn't survive because of the British Navy, or fierce storms, or navigational disaster. They survived because the galleon itself was one of the most brutally effective mobile weapons platforms ever constructed by human hands. And most pirates who tried to take one didn't live long enough to understand why. Hit subscribe before we get into this one, because today we're talking about the ship that made the Spanish Empire possible. The ship that pirates spent 200 years trying and mostly failing to crack. And the wreck sitting at 600 meters under the Caribbean right now, with $11 billion still inside it. Now here is the thing most people get wrong immediately. When you picture a galleon, you probably picture something romantic. Tall sails, dark wood, maybe a skull and crossbones somewhere. What you're actually picturing is the mythology. The reality of a fully armed Spanish treasure galleon in the 1500s was closer to what we would today call a naval destroyer than anything from a storybook. These ships were not built for beauty. They were not built for speed. They were built specifically to be impossible to kill, difficult to board, and capable of delivering catastrophic violence to anything that came within range. Every design decision, from the curve of the hull to the angle of the gun ports to the width of the deck, was made with one calculation in mind. How do we make it harder for someone to take what's inside? To understand why that calculation mattered so much, you have to understand what was happening in the world in the 1500s. Spain had just done something that no country in human history had ever done before. They had found an entire other hemisphere. 2 continents full of gold and silver and resources on a scale that made European economies look like village markets. The Spanish crown moved fast. They built extraction operations across Peru and Mexico and Colombia that were pulling hundreds of tons of precious metal out of the ground every single year. And all of it, every ingot, every chest of coins, every sack of silver, had to travel the same route home. Across the Caribbean, through the Florida Straits, across the Atlantic to Seville. That route was not a secret. Every pirate, every privateer, every rival navy in Europe knew exactly where the treasure was going and exactly when. The Spanish crown knew they knew. And so the galleon became not just a ship, but a statement. A declaration that said, yes, we are sailing these waters with everything we have, and no, you are not going to take it from us. The galleon was the answer to the question of how you move 2 billion pesos across an ocean through waters crawling with people who would kill you for it. The answer was overwhelming, calculated, engineered force. What almost no one talks about is how the galleon program started. The word itself comes from the Spanish word GALLEON, which was already in use for large warships, but the specific design we're talking about, the treasure galleon, the Atlantic carrier, was essentially invented in the 1530s and 40s by a Spanish naval architect named Álvaro de Bazán the Elder. His son, who shared the name, would go on to be one of Spain's most celebrated admirals. But the father did something arguably more important. He looked at the problem of moving massive wealth across a hostile ocean, and he engineered a solution from first principles. Not just a bigger ship, a fundamentally different kind of ship. A ship where the cargo space, the weapons systems, and the defensive architecture were all designed together as a single integrated machine. The Spanish crown looked at his plans and funded a whole class of them, and then they sent them into the Atlantic, loaded with enough gold to buy countries. By the 1570s, the system was running at full capacity. Every year, two great fleets departed from Spain. The Flota de Tierra Firme, headed for Colombia and Panama. The Flota de Nueva España, headed for Mexico and Cuba. They loaded their holds in the Americas through the summer. They gathered in Havana in the fall. And then they sailed home together. Dozens of ships, galleons, escort warships, smaller patrol vessels, in a convoy formation that was deliberately designed to make piracy not just dangerous, but mathematically irrational. You couldn't raid a convoy of 30 ships. You couldn't outrun the escort frigates. You couldn't get to the treasure galleons because they were in the middle, surrounded by armed vessels on every side. The system worked. It worked well enough that Spain ran it for more than 2 centuries. It worked well enough that the entire gold and silver economy of early modern Europe was essentially underwritten by Spanish galleons crossing the Atlantic twice a year on a schedule almost as reliable as a train timetable. But the system had a weakness. It always has a weakness. The weakness was not force. Nobody was going to beat a Spanish convoy fleet in a straight fight. The weakness was the edges. The individual ships that got separated from the fleet. The galleons that had to make an unscheduled stop. The vessels that fell behind and found themselves alone in waters where they had no business being alone. A galleon in convoy was nearly untouchable. A galleon alone, even with its guns and its soldiers and its engineered defenses, was something different. It was a very dangerous prize. And the pirates of the Caribbean spent most of 200 years trying to figure out exactly how dangerous. Francis Drake was 34 years old when he sailed into the Pacific Ocean and found a ship he had no business finding. The year was 1579. Drake was in the middle of the most audacious voyage in the history of English piracy, a voyage that would eventually make him the second man in history to circumnavigate the globe. He had already done things that should have been impossible. He had sailed through the Strait of Magellan, which was considered by most Spanish navigators to be barely passable even in ideal conditions with a single ship. He had raided Spanish ports on the Pacific coast of South America, where the Spanish crown had not bothered to fortify heavily because they believed the Strait of Magellan was protection enough. And he had accumulated a respectable haul: gold, silver, miscellaneous plunder from smaller vessels. And then on the 1st of March, 1579, somewhere off the coast of what is now Ecuador, Drake's lookout spotted a large ship moving north. Her name was Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. She was a Manila galleon, one of the Spanish vessels that carried cargo across the Pacific from the Philippines to the Americas. Her captain was a man named Juan de Anton, and she was carrying something that immediately reclassified everything Drake had collected up to that point as pocket change. Her hold contained approximately 400,000 pesos in gold coins, silver bars, and precious gems. Chests of pearls, 13 cases of silver plate, 26 tons of uncut silver. Some accounts add emeralds from Colombia, gold from Peru, jewels from the Philippines. The total modern equivalent is difficult to calculate because the 16th century peso does not map cleanly onto contemporary currency, but the conservative estimate puts it somewhere above $7 million today, and some historians go significantly higher. Drake wanted that ship. Here is the thing. Drake was commanding the Golden Hind, which was a vessel of roughly 100 tons with about 100 men and 18 guns. The Concepcion, which Drake's crew had taken to calling the Cacafuego, a nickname that doesn't translate cleanly into polite English, but roughly means something like fire spitter, was a substantially larger vessel. She was not a full Atlantic treasure galleon, which would have been an entirely different category of problem, but she was armed, crewed by trained sailors, and had every reason to put up a serious fight. Drake didn't attack immediately. He thought about it first. What he did next tells you more about how successful piracy actually worked than almost anything else in the historical record. Drake ordered his crew to drag wine jugs filled with water behind the ship in a long line. The drag slowed the Golden Hind to roughly the same speed as the Cacafuego. To any observer, the Golden Hind looked like a heavily laden merchant vessel, low in the water, moving slowly, presenting no obvious threat. She was disguised by physics. And she followed the Cacafuego for the entire day. Then, as darkness fell and Juan de Anton's crew relaxed, Drake ordered the jugs cut. The Golden Hind leaped forward. What followed was not the romantic broadside duel of naval mythology. Drake fired a single volley aimed specifically at the Cacafuego's rigging and steering gear, not at her hull. One of Drake's marksmen put a crossbow bolt into Juan de Anton's cheek. The Cacafuego's mizzenmast came down. She lost steering, and in the sudden chaos, before her crew could organize a coherent defense, Drake's men were over the rail. The whole action took less than 20 minutes. Drake spent the next 3 days on that ship, transferring cargo. 3 full days. The Golden Hind sat so low in the water by the end that Drake was reportedly worried she would founder. He gave Juan de Anton a letter of safe conduct, which was a gesture of remarkable self-confidence given what he'd just done. He told de Anton that if he met Queen Elizabeth of England, he could present the letter and she would compensate him for his losses. De Anton kept the letter. He was not reimbursed. Drake sailed away with the largest single pirate haul in the history of the Pacific. He never tried to take a galleon again. That detail is important. Drake was not a man who shied away from ambitious targets. He spent the rest of his career raiding Spanish possessions and fighting Spanish fleets. He was brilliant, aggressive, willing to take enormous risks. But he understood what the capture of the Cacafuego actually told him. The ship he'd taken was a Pacific cargo vessel, not a frontline Atlantic treasure galleon. She was lightly armed by galleon standards. Her crew was not a professional fighting force. The conditions had been almost uniquely favorable. A pursuit in open water, perfect weather, a target moving alone without escort, and a captain who didn't recognize the threat until it was too late. Duplicate those conditions exactly, and you had a shot. Change any one of them, and the math fell apart. Drake understood the math. Now set that story alongside a different one. A story that happened 129 years later in 1708 in the Caribbean Sea, off the coast of what is now Colombia. The San Jose was a galleon of a different category entirely. She was launched in Cadiz in 1698. 64 guns, a crew of 600 men. She was the flagship of the Spanish treasure fleet, the vessel that commanded the entire convoy, the ship that carried the most important cargo, and therefore the most firepower. She was making her final run of the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that had been draining both Spain and her enemies for years. She was carrying the accumulated wealth of several seasons of extraction from the Peruvian silver mines at Potosí and the gold fields of Nueva Granada. The total cargo has been estimated by historians and treasure hunters and lawyers and governments for 300 years now. The figures vary. The conservative modern estimate is approximately $4.8 billion. Some analyses, accounting for the full manifest and the current market value of platinum coins that were also in the hold, put the number at 11 billion. $11 billion on one ship. On the 17th of June, 1708, a British squadron under Commodore Charles Wager found her. Wager had 4 ships. The San Jose had her convoy, but Wager was aggressive and his intelligence was good, and he positioned his lead vessel, the HMS Expedition, close enough to engage the San Jose directly while the rest of the convoy scattered. The battle lasted 17 minutes. What exactly caused the San Jose to sink is still debated. The most likely explanation, supported by contemporary accounts and the physical evidence later examined on the wreck, is that a British cannonball struck one of her powder magazines. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The San Jose went down so fast that virtually no one on her decks had time to get clear. All 600 crew members were lost. The treasure, still in the hold, went with her. She hit the bottom at roughly 600 meters, and there she stayed for exactly 307 years. Before we get to what happened next, let's talk about what actually made the galleon so hard to take. Because this is the part that most histories skip over, and it's the part that explains everything else, including why the San Jose's captain sailed into that engagement without flinching, why Drake only tried it once, and why the 3% capture rate is not a statistical anomaly, but the completely predictable result of specific engineering decisions. Start with the hull. A standard pirate vessel of the Golden Age, the sloop or the brigantine that most Caribbean pirates operated, had a hull planked with timber roughly 2 to 3 inches thick. This was sufficient to keep water out and light enough to allow the speed that made piracy viable. Speed was the pirate's primary weapon. You couldn't fight a navy. You couldn't survive being caught. So you built fast and light, and you chose your targets accordingly. A Spanish treasure galleon's hull was a different proposition entirely. The outer planking on a galleon of the treasure fleet ran to 4 to 6 inches of dense hardwood, typically Spanish cedar or tropical hardwoods sourced from the Caribbean shipyards at Havana. Behind that outer skin was an inner layer of structural framing, then another layer of inner planking, and the whole assembly was held together with wooden tree nails and iron bolts in a configuration that produced a composite wall roughly 12 to 16 inches thick at the waterline. 12 to 16 inches. A 4-pound cannonball, which was a standard armament on a smaller pirate vessel, hitting that wall at 200 yards would not penetrate. It would leave a dent, maybe, if the shot was perfectly square and the gun was well charged. A 6-pound ball was more likely to cause structural cracking, but still unlikely to produce a breach. To actually punch through a galleon's hull at combat range, you needed a 12-pounder at minimum, and realistically, an 18-pounder to do meaningful damage in a single engagement. Most pirate ships did not carry 18-pounders. The weight of the gun, the weight of the ammunition, and the structural reinforcement required to absorb the recoil from a gun that size made it incompatible with the kind of fast, nimble vessel that piracy required. You could have a fast ship or a ship that could damage a galleon. You could not easily have both. But the hull was only the beginning. A fully armed Spanish galleon of the treasure fleet period carried between 40 and 74 cannon, arranged on 2 gun decks. The lower gun deck, closest to the waterline, carried the heaviest pieces, typically 24-pounders or 32-pounders, the guns that could sink another ship with a single, well-placed round. The upper gun deck carried lighter guns, typically 9-pounders and 12-pounders, designed for closer range work and for engaging enemy rigging and crew. Above those, on the open deck, were swivel guns mounted on the rail, Small-bore weapons loaded with grape shot or nails or scrap metal that could clear an exposed deck of approaching men at close range with horrifying efficiency. A galleon with 60 guns and 300 soldiers, which was a reasonable mid-sized treasure galleon of the 1600s, represented a weapons platform that could simultaneously engage multiple targets, maintain fire across a wide arc, and absorb enormous punishment without losing fighting capacity. She could put out roughly 1.5 tons of iron per broadside. Her guns could reach out to 700 or 800 yards with accuracy, further with luck. A pirate sloop with 12 guns and 80 men could put out perhaps 300 pounds of iron per broadside. Her guns might reach 300 yards with reliability. The math is not ambiguous. In the first exchange of fire between a prepared galleon crew and a standard pirate attack, what happened was this. The galleon's lower gun deck, firing at close range, produced hits that the pirate vessel could not absorb. Structural failures cascaded. The smaller ship either went down or was disabled before she could close to boarding range. If, by some combination of luck and maneuvering, the pirates did close to boarding range, they met a second problem: the boarding net. This is the piece of galleon defense that almost never makes it into popular history, but it was arguably more important than the guns. A treasure galleon underway in potentially hostile waters would rig a network of heavy rope netting, sometimes reinforced with chain links, along her entire upper rail and across her open decks. The net was designed to prevent exactly one thing: men climbing over the rail. It worked. A man coming over a galleon's side in a boarding action hit the net at full momentum and stopped. He was then in an exposed position, entangled, unable to bring his weapons to bear effectively, while the crew on the inside of the net could do whatever they wanted to him at leisure. The netting was supplemented by deliberate structural design. Galleons had high sterns and high forecastles specifically to create elevated firing positions that overlooked the main deck. Soldiers positioned in those elevated structures could fire down into a boarding party on the main deck with pistols and muskets and dropped projectiles. The design transformed the ship's architecture into a series of mutually supporting defensive positions, each one covering the others, each one difficult to neutralize without already having control of another. None of this was accidental. Every element of the galleon's design was the product of accumulated experience with exactly the kind of attacks pirates attempted. The Spanish crown had been running these ships for decades. They had documented every attack, every near miss, every successful defense, every rare case where a galleon was taken. They had studied the pattern. They knew how pirates thought. They knew that the first objective was always to disable the steering, that the second was to bring down the masts, that the third was to get men over the rail before the crew could organize. And they had engineered responses to all three. The steering was protected by armored screens. The masts were replaced on the lower sections with thicker timber that required sustained fire to bring down. And the boarding net addressed the rail problem directly. Here's the thing that makes the 3% capture rate actually remarkable. It's not that 3% is a surprisingly low number. It's that 3% is a surprisingly high number. Given the asymmetry of force, given the engineering, given the crew sizes and training levels and firepower differentials, the correct prediction from first principles would have been closer to 0. The only reason it was 3% was because some pirates had figured something out that the engineering couldn't fix. The galleon's defenses were nearly perfect against a direct assault. Against deception, they were almost useless. Every pirate who successfully captured a galleon in the historical record used the same basic playbook: false flag, disguise, misdirection. Something designed to get the galleon's captain to let his guard down before the attacker revealed what he actually was. Drake's drag bottles trick was deception. He looked like a slow merchant until he wasn't. Henry Every, who took the Ganges Sawai in 1695, had intelligence that the Mughal vessel would be alone and her captain distracted. He used that knowledge to position his attack at exactly the moment of maximum vulnerability. Bartholomew Roberts, who captured dozens of vessels, almost never attacked anything that knew he was coming. His speed and his intelligence network were tools for manufacturing surprise. Surprise was the only weapon that could reliably bridge the gap between what a pirate ship could do and what a galleon could withstand. The pattern held across the entire Golden Age. Successful pirate attacks on fortified vessels clustered around the same variables. 1. The target was isolated from support. 2. The target's crew was in some state of disorder or surprise. 3. The attack came from an unexpected angle or in an unexpected form. Remove any one of those 3 variables, and the success rate collapsed towards 0. This tells you something important about how intelligence worked in the Caribbean in the 17th century. The pirate captains who survived long enough to build reputations were not primarily fighters. They were primarily information gatherers. They had networks of contacts in colonial ports who told them when ships were departing, what they were carrying, how many soldiers were aboard, whether the captain was competent. They traded in knowledge the way merchants traded in goods. And the information they prized most was not where the treasure was. It was when the defenses were weakest. The galleon was a problem of engineering. The pirates who solved it understood that you don't beat engineering with force. You beat it with timing. Leave a comment below and tell me this. If you were a pirate captain with one ship and full knowledge of what a galleon could do, what's your play? Full assault? Deception? Do you just sail the other direction? I want to know what you think, because the people who actually tried it had very different answers, and most of them ended badly. The San Jose was found on the 4th of November 2015 by a joint research team working under contract with the Colombian government. The ship was located using underwater survey equipment at a depth of approximately 600 meters in the Caribbean Sea off the coast of Cartagena. The survey team identified the wreck by matching the distinctive bronze cannon cast with distinctive dolphin-shaped handles that were specific to the San Jose's armament to historical records. Those cannon are still there. The cargo is still there. The ship, or what remains of it after 3 centuries on the bottom, is still intact enough that researchers have been able to examine the hull structure and the arrangement of the cargo. The man who was most responsible for finding her was a maritime archaeologist named Roger Dooley, working with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. The discovery was one of the most significant finds in the history of underwater archaeology, and it immediately triggered one of the most complicated legal battles in the history of international maritime law. Here is who currently claims the San Jose and her cargo. Colombia claims her because she went down in Colombian territorial waters, because the cargo was extracted from Colombian land, and because Colombian law regards the wreck as a national cultural monument. The Colombian government has stated that any recovery operation must be conducted by the Colombian Navy, must keep the cargo in Colombia, and must treat the site primarily as an archaeological site rather than a salvage operation. Spain claims her because she was a Spanish naval vessel, because her crew were Spanish sailors on a Spanish military mission, and because, under international maritime law, warships do not lose their sovereign status by sinking. Spain has argued before international bodies that the San Jose is legally a Spanish naval vessel and that her contents belong to the Spanish crown, or its successor state, the Spanish government. A private American salvage company called Sea Search Armada claims a portion of her cargo because they located the general area of the wreck in 1981, decades before the Colombian government's official discovery, and signed a contract with Colombia at the time that promised them a percentage of any recovered treasure. When Colombia changed its laws and declared such contracts invalid, Sea Search Armada went to American courts. They have been in litigation for more than 40 years. The Bolivian government has also raised a claim on the grounds that much of the silver on board was mined by indigenous Bolivian laborers under conditions of forced labor at the Potosi mines, and that the moral claim to the treasure therefore belongs to the descendants of those workers. No court has yet rendered a final judgment that all parties have accepted. The treasure stays at the bottom, 600 meters down, in the dark, right where the San Jose put it on the 17th of June, 1708. There is something in that fact that deserves a moment. Not the money, though the money is extraordinary. Not the legal complexity, though the legal complexity is genuinely fascinating. What deserves the moment is the stubborn persistence of it. The galleon was built to be impossible to take, and the San Jose has been impossible to take, not for days or weeks or the duration of a battle, but for 317 years. Every one of the competing claims, Spain and Colombia and the salvage company and the descendants of the miners, is in some sense an attempt to finally take what the ship has been keeping, and the ship is still not giving it up. That tells you something about what the galleon was at the deepest level. It was not just a ship. It was a vault that the Spanish Empire sent out into the Atlantic twice a year with the implicit message that the vault was its own lock, that the engineering and the guns and the soldiers and the design and the sheer physical mass of the thing were sufficient security that no letter of credit, no bank contract, no promise of repayment was required. You sent the galleon out with the gold. The galleon brought the gold home. If the galleon didn't come home, you built another galleon. The economics of it were brutal. Spain lost perhaps 1 in 12 of her treasure galleons over the entire run of the system. She lost them to storms, to navigational error, to disease that swept through crew in the tropical heat, occasionally to enemy action. The losses were staggering in absolute terms, but the system continued because the gold that got through was sufficient to fund an empire. You could absorb the losses and still profit. The math worked. The galleon made the math work. Francis Drake understood this on some level. He understood it when he sailed away from the Cacafuego with his hold full of silver and never attempted another galleon. He understood that the Cacafuego had been a once-in-a-generation alignment of favorable conditions, that what he'd done was less a demonstration of pirate capability than a demonstration of how completely exceptional circumstances had to be before the favorable outcome became possible. Most pirates never found those circumstances. Most pirates who went looking for them didn't survive the search. Henry Every had a version of it right when he took the Ganji Sawai. He had a bigger crew than Drake, a better armed ship, and better intelligence. He also benefited from the fact that his target was not a Spanish naval galleon, but a Mughal merchant vessel that, despite her armament, was not prepared for the level of assault he brought. Even then, the action nearly went the other way. The Ganji Sawai's captain, Ibrahim Khan, managed to fire his own guns during the engagement. One of them misfired catastrophically on deck, killing members of his own crew. Another round went through Every's ship without detonating. Small things. The difference between the richest pirate in history and a name on a list of men who tried and died. The galleon did not forgive poor planning, and the San Jose, the greatest of them all, the ship carrying more wealth than most nations could generate in a decade, found the one set of conditions that could stop her. Not a pirate with a clever plan. Not a captain with a perfectly timed attack. A British naval officer with 4 warships and a lucky cannonball that found the powder magazine. 17 minutes, 600 lives, $11 billion. Gone. Or rather, not gone. Transformed. The San Jose didn't lose her cargo. She kept it. She's kept it for 3 centuries, through legal battles and salvage attempts and Cold War-era diplomatic disputes and 21st century technology that can see her on the bottom with instruments that would have seemed like witchcraft to Juan de Anton's sailors. The gold is still there. The emeralds are still there. The coins minted in the silver mines of Potosi, struck by men whose names no one recorded, are still sitting in their chests at 600 meters depth in the Caribbean Sea, waiting for the governments of 3 countries and the lawyers of a private salvage company to reach an agreement that 3 centuries of argument suggests they may never reach. There is a version of history in which the galleon was beaten. Drake found a way. A few others found ways, rare and exceptional and unrepeatable. They took ships at the margins, in the exceptional circumstances, with the kind of luck that doesn't repeat. They got away with it, and they knew they'd gotten away with it. And the smart ones, like Drake, understood that the margin between their success and disaster was thin enough to thread a needle through. But the galleon as a system, as an institution, as the armored spine of the Spanish Empire's economic order, was never beaten. The pirates of the Caribbean spent 200 years probing its weaknesses, and the rate never moved past 3%. 3% is not a failure of the system. 3% is the system working exactly as designed, with a small allowance for human ingenuity that the engineers couldn't quite eliminate. The Spanish crown knew about the 3%. They planned for it. They built it into the math. Somewhere in the archives in Seville, in the Casa de Contratación records that Spain kept fastidiously across the entire era of the treasure fleets. There are documents that account for exactly these losses. Line items, expected shrinkage. The gold that didn't make it home is recorded there with the same administrative neutrality as the gold that did. It was a cost of doing business, a rounding error in an operation that moved more wealth across more water over more years than any financial system before or since. The pirates thought they were fighting the galleon. They were actually fighting an accountant's spreadsheet. And the accountants won. Stand on the waterfront in Cartagena today, in the old walled city that the Spanish built specifically to protect the staging area for the treasure fleet, and look out toward the Caribbean. The water is the same color it was in 1708. The horizon is the same distance. On a clear day, you can see maybe 15 miles out before the curve of the earth takes everything below the line. The San Jose went down somewhere beyond that line, where you can't see from shore. She's still there. The galleon is still there. 317 years after she went down, and the Spanish crown, the Colombian Navy, the lawyers from Washington, the historians from every university that has weighed in on this case, none of them have managed to do what Francis Drake almost did in 1579. With 100 men and 18 guns and a string of wine jugs trailing in the water. They haven't taken the treasure. The galleon is still keeping it. Think about that the next time someone tells you that piracy was romantic. Think about 600 men going into the water in 17 minutes. Think about Drake sailing away, hold full, understanding exactly how close to disaster he had come, and choosing never to try it again. Think about the engineers in the Spanish royal shipyards of the 1500s who sat down with a problem. How do you move 2 billion pesos across an ocean full of people who want to kill you for it? And built a machine so effective that 3 centuries later, at the bottom of the Caribbean, the machine is still doing its job. The galleon was never just a ship. It was an argument, and the argument is still running. If this episode made you think differently about what the golden age of piracy actually was, share it with someone who still thinks it was all skull and crossbones and romance. Subscribe to Dead Man's Shore if you haven't already, because we do this every week. Real history, real people. The stories that don't fit the myth. I'm Jack. I'll see you at the next one.